Hello, and welcome to the Transforming Loneliness interview series. I'm Laura Parker, the creator and host of the series. Transforming Loneliness approaches loneliness with fresh and unexpected ways of seeing and responding that cultivate connection, belonging, and love. Today, I'm very happy to be with Lily Myers Kaplan. Lily is the founder and director of Spirit of Resh Foundation, the author of Two Rare Birds, A Legacy of Love, and Hermitage host at her property, the Sanctuary at Rainbow Ridge in Applegate, Oregon. Awakening soul and transforming life's most challenging circumstances into meaning and purpose is at the core of Lily's service. One thing I love about Lily is her courage. I mean this in the rootedness of courage in the heart. Lily is passionate and devoted to embracing life in all its dimensions, which includes engagement with transforming humanity's personal and cultural relationship with the end of life. Welcome, Lily, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Laura. I'm really glad you invited me.
So, Lily, your organization, Spirit of Resh Foundation, envisions a cultural alignment in which people embrace death as a way of enhancing life. How does our relationship with death, either the acceptance or denial of it, influence loneliness?
Well, I think it influences it in a really big way, actually. And I'm going to speak about death in a bunch of different ways. First of all, we all go through all kinds of death throughout our lives. We have to go from being a kid to an adolescent, from an adolescent to a young adult, and so each of these passages, what some people call rite of passage, it's a death. It's a death of the old way of being in order to accept the new way of being. And I think of all of those passages as practice for the big death that's going to happen to all of us. And to the extent that we don't accept that we're going to die, to the extent that we don't accept our own mortality, I think we get cut off from the preciousness of life and the reality that this moment is really all we have. So if we accept our mortality, it gives us a sense of urgency of how we live. And so if we have that sense of urgency, we're going to be more connected to what matters to us, what's important, how we live, how we serve, what has meaning for us. And that's connection, whether it's connection with self, connection with other, connection with community, all of those ways that connection comes through accepting death. And so I think it's a really important thing that in our culture, mostly people are afraid of death. And so that means we're afraid of our own vulnerability. And you can't have connection without vulnerability. I could go on and on and on, but I want to just say that in a general way first.
Yeah, and so it sounds like what you're saying is that in this way that we're cut off from the preciousness of life because we're denying we're denying death, that's ultimately very lonely, that it's lonely to be cut off from the preciousness of life.
It is lonely to be cut off from the preciousness of life. And there was something else I wanted to say. I wanted to look at my notes about how death is a universal experience. It's the one thing that we absolutely have in common with every other, not just human being on the planet, but every other living being on the planet. We're going to die. And when we embrace that, we're connected to that which is across the board. It doesn't matter what color you are, what country you're from. We have this in common. And to know that, and not just know it with our heads, but to know it with our hearts, it really opens the heart. It opens the heart to each other. And I would say that First of all, Spirit of Resh Foundation was founded in honor of my sister and brother-in-law who died 9 months apart after 14 years of sharing, both of them having cancer, back and forth in tandem until they were diagnosed on the same day with a reoccurrence. So this last couple years of their life was really intensified of what it meant to be alive and what it meant to face death. And that experience so dramatically opened my heart to love as the most important thing. And it's really not a surprise to learn that across the board, most people, when they're on their deathbed, what they did with their life is less important than how they loved in their life, and who loved them and who they loved and how well they loved. And so this really speaks to this idea that you're having about transforming loneliness is about, on my deathbed, how do I want to go out? Do I want to be lying there feeling like, oh, shoot, I was really going to say a different word, but crap, I didn't love very well. Look at all these places I hid myself from life. I want to be able to be on my deathbed saying, I loved well, and be able to then more easily and gently go out, whatever that means.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so rich. There's so many layers to what you're talking about. And in particular, when you said death is universal and it's something that we all have in common, and yet because of our denial of it and shame about it, we tend to hide out. And so we even miss the chance to connect even in our end of life experience. But that is something that it has in common with loneliness, because loneliness is another one of those things that is universal. It's a point of connection among humans. And yet when we experience loneliness, we tend to hide it. So.
Yeah. And sometimes that loneliness is something that we're carrying from other people in our lives who have died, our ancestors. And one of the things that I learned, first of all, I learned this not just as I healed my relationship with my sister as she was dying. And it was a 14-year journey of brain cancer that she walked. And I walked with her. And we had many difficulties in our relationship that over those 14 years we sorted out, so that by the time she was taking her last breath, I felt whole with her. But it was really after she died and I started writing Two Rare Birds, which was about Lois and Dave, that's their names, my sister and brother-in-law, the two rare birds who really awakened love to me, the legacy of love. In that process of writing their story and my story of awakening, I came to understand that she and I were enacting and carrying out ancestral wounds in the way that we related to one another. And the wounds of neglect or pain, or my ancestors were immigrants and what they had to go through to escape the pogroms in Eastern Europe and to get to the United States, and then to make it as really poor immigrants in a country that didn't welcome immigrants even then. Can talk about that, but in terms of loneliness. So the tension in that family, my father's family, was great. It was intense. And we didn't realize that we were enacting that. But as I was writing, and that's the power of writing, really, journaling, whatever kind of writing, I came to understand that this ancestral wound was something we were carrying out. And we were healing, not just for us, between she and I, two individual people, but all the way back and back and back through our ancestral line, even beyond those we knew or know the names of. And I think that's a powerful thing that we don't give credit to in our culture, that there are invisible forces in each of us that we're carrying out in how we relate to each other and the world.
Yes, and these come more forward and into our consciousness, I think, during times like death, when we're close to a big transition, a big event. I'm not, the word is, there's a better word, but it's failing me at the moment.
Event is a good word for it, actually, because
Okay.
it's an event for everybody, not just a person who's dying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like I I could hear when you were talking how much this transition that you went through with your sister brought forward in your um, sitting with it afterwards, and your writing brought forward all these ancestral patterns that you were enacting, and they were invisible and you weren't even really aware of it. But I have found that similarly, as I've just engaged with the presence and somatic experience of what loneliness feels like. I've only followed one of my lines, but my mother line. So my mother, my mother's mother, and my mother's mother, I have seen that there's a profound pattern of isolation, abandonment, alonement, and then the strategies that they use to cope with that then kind of reinforce the isolation. So it has been very interesting for me to observe the patterns of isolation that are part of my lineage. And then as I expanded my perception out, I saw, of course, that this goes way back to colonialism and patterns of white supremacy and domination of other peoples. These patterns of kind of isolating and separating humanity into these different categories, etc. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but that's just another example of the way that the ancestral wound is related to loneliness. So there's so many threads here that we could follow, and it's very rich. So before we move on to the next question, was there just anything else you wanted to say about
I'm
that?
so glad you asked that, because as you were talking, I made some notes. I wanted to say that in healing, first of all, whenever I use the word healing, I don't mean fixing what's broken. I really mean opening our compassion to what's broken in our world and in ourselves. So I use the word healing. You were using the word transforming loneliness. So in this ancestral wounding that we're carrying, that let's just assume that's true, that we're all carrying some ancestral wounding. And if we assume that's true, then if we're trying to heal ourselves and maybe transform this experience of loneliness or this experience of lack of connection, then maybe our work isn't in the realm of psychologizing ourselves and figuring out what to fix and how to change and how to grow. And of course, all that has value, but there's something bigger. And that's what I experience when people come on Hermitage here. And you had asked me, or we had talked earlier about how does this solitude of Hermitage heal this experience of loneliness, because it seems like an oxymoron. But what I witness over and over again is that people begin out on the land to do processes or ceremonies that feed the ancestors. And I can't explain why, but it happens with every single person who comes here. I would say 95% of the people who come here end up doing some kind of work that goes back to those who have died, whose wounds we are carrying. So it's like extending our compassion and our love to them and to help heal them, known and unknown ancestors. And even those who have been the perpetrators of that wounding that we're experiencing, and so many people experience neglect or an abuse and, pain from their parents, grandparents, great parents, uncles, aunts, so to actually see that they were wounded and that's how they wounded us begins a process of healing for us as we, and forgiveness, people react to, I can't forgive this thing that happened. It's not even about forgiveness. It's about like putting a healing balm on those who have wounded us so that they can be healed, so that we can be healed. And it's amazing how people connect more
Right.
deeply. And the other thing I just want to say about that is that the natural world is inherently whole. And so when we do our work in the natural world, we're connecting to something that is whole in ourselves. And that becomes the way that we can connect to something outside of ourselves. So that doing that work in nature connects us to our own wholeness, connects us to our connection to ourselves, from which all other connections are born. So I said a lot of different things there, but
Yeah.
how the ancestors and helping them, and I've had people say, sorry I'm going on so long, but I've had people say, why the hell do I have to heal them? Why is it my job? And I said, well, you don't have to. I remember this one person who was here and she was so mad. And I said, so be angry and go out and stomp around in the woods and express that anger. And it led her to such a profound place of understanding that it serves all of us to do that work. It's not just individual.
Yes, wonderful. And I love that about why the hell do I have to do it? And then you said, well, you don't have to. It is always a choice. We can choose to say no, but I think that saying no then has its repercussions. And yeah, and we are all where we are, so we do what we can.
Right.
And I do find that for me, um, I had a similar, when I heard you talking, my reaction was, yeah, I kind of felt that way when I was feeling that I was being invited to do this loneliness work. Part of me went, oh no, not that. Like that's too intense, or it's too close to home, or it's too big. And then I just realized, oh yeah, but it is mine to do, and what else am I going to do? So, like my choice, I do have a lot of time on my hands, and I just decided, well, I think I'd rather do this than watch Netflix. So here I am.
And no doubt transforming yourself through it because, heal or heal thyself.
It is huge. It is just tremendous to be engaged in this encounter with loneliness and what it is, and why it's here.
Yeah.
Because it is a very big presence that is here for a reason, and it will not go away. Our attempts to make it go away are futile. But I mean, so really, the choice to say yes to it and to dance with it is what the other choice that's available, other than trying to just continue getting rid of it, which doesn't work.
Right.
So, all right, that was a lovely tangent, and I'm going to return to our interview questions here. So when we were preparing for this interview, we entered into a conversation about finding meaning in one's wounding and translating that meaning into purpose. Is there anything else you want to say about that? We seem to have touched on it a little bit, but anything else you want to say about that? How does that happen?
Well, first of all, I want to say that loneliness is part of the human condition. By its very nature, being human and being in a body separates us from the largeness of life, and then learning how to navigate the world from inside our bodies with other people, with other bodies. That's a skill. That's something that comes over time, and to like you were just saying, to try to get rid of it is a cutting off of something that's just inherent and making it wrong. So to say, it's the same thing for me, the cultural realignment that Spirit of Rush is always looking for is, embracing death so that it enhances the way we live, embracing loneliness so that we come to a compassionate relationship with our own humanity. And to do that necessitates finding meaning. I think not assigning meaning, but finding meaning in our wounding. What did that neglect develop in me or teach me? What did that loneliness? I remember lying on the bed on a Friday night at 12 or 13 years old and calling every single girlfriend I had in my book, and they all had plans already with somebody else. And why was I the one that was alone? And to lie there and to be alone, and my sisters were off, older sisters were off doing something, and there was I by myself. We didn't have Netflix back then, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which. But at any rate, there I was. And so I can avoid that pain. I could avoid that pain. I probably avoided that pain for a long time in my life. But to turn toward it and to say, well, what did it give me? What did I develop through that pain? And I developed a lot of independence, and what you said about me, which thank you very much, courage, of the heart. I developed a lot of courage to go find my own unique path in the world. And yeah, there was a cost to that. But finding my way by saying, yeah, let me remember and feel that pain again and look for the gift in it and embrace and celebrate the gift, then enables me to choose something different, to choose, because I found meaning in that. And then I found purpose in that. So, it got me into service toward other people.
Yeah. And I do think there's a fine line there because, and I think you and I already talked about this, that if we're in the middle of the searing pain of something, to jump to trying to find the meaning of it right away or to jump to that too quickly is not the right thing to do. That actually just meeting the pain in its just visceral intensity. And I'm a big advocate of feeling things in our body, like the somatic processing or encounter of whatever an emotion or an experience is how I try to first meet it. And then, later on we can get to finding meaning. And I loved what you said about finding meaning instead of assigning meaning. That's such a different, like finding meaning means that I'm in a kind of a relationship of reciprocality or something, like I'm not the leader and the pain is the follower. I love that there's a way that I need to be open and receptive to hear what the meaning is trying to tell me instead of imposing my preconceptions or my rejection onto it,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And meaning leads to purpose. Finding the meaning leads to purpose, and purpose, I believe, is the antidote for loneliness or for disconnection or for, whatever purpose it is, whether it's I go to the Humane Society once a week and walk dogs or pet cats or rabbits or whatever. or it means that I become a therapist, or it means that I, hold a hermitage, or, I believe that service connects us to a higher calling, and that is healing to the wounded self.
It
And
is.
I wanted to mention that the Spirit of Resh Foundation is engaged right now as a partner with some other people here in Southern Oregon to create something we're calling the Compassionate Community Project. And it is to train people in what we're calling death literacy, but really it's about how to be present with aging, illness, death, and bereavement, to know how to be there with each other, how to be present, to know what to say to somebody who's grieving, to know how to sit with somebody who's ill, to know, rather than shy away from this thing called death that everybody's so afraid of. And if we can open, and that's the cultural realignment that we're talking about, and whether it's death or loneliness or pain or hurt or grieving or bereavement or whatever the thing is, if we can learn how to be present with it and then be of service to one another, because you're my neighbor and I'm your neighbor. And if, like when really this was the beginning of Spirit of Resh Foundation, was seeing how, having two people with cancer in the same household with no kids, a whole community of people showed up, and they brought food and they mowed the lawn and they ironed shirts and they sat in presence with, and these were people that maybe Lois and Dave barely knew, who lived down the street, or Dave worked with, or Lois had played soccer with 20 years before. And so neighbors supporting neighbors, and I mean neighbor in the broadest sense of it, not just people who live next door to me, but people who are part of my community. And maybe, this is the way it used to be in some idealized 1950s community idea. However, there is something that got lost with the connection through technology versus the connection in a everyday way. And so that, just anyway, to come back to this idea of service, of purpose that leads to service, that leads to neighbors connecting with neighbors, I believe that builds the possibility for kind of intimacy with self and other that transforms loneliness, because it reconnects us.
Thank you for sharing about that project that you're doing. And I think that that's such an example of the ways, one of the ways that we can, like you said, find a way to be of service. And that does, I totally believe you that it transforms loneliness to have purpose and to be in service. It takes us outside of our preoccupation with our own self. And I do feel like that is a fallout of modern culture, the culture of individualism, and how shameful it is to ask for help or to need help. And we have this immediate assumption that it's a weakness. And even though many of us might intellectually challenge that and say, oh yeah, I know it's good to reach out for help, how many of us actually do it? Or how many of us do we find? I know for myself, the inclination is to still try and find a way I can do it myself, rather than reaching out. So let's see. You mentioned that you're working on a second book, and it's called Lost to Legacy, A Stepping Stone Path to Healing and Transformation. And you use the word legacy in the subtitle. It seems like you may have already touched on this a little bit in our talk so far, but I'm just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to say about what does legacy, and love for that matter, have to do with healing and transformation? Is there anything else you'd like to add on that?
Well, I think we often think, again, culturally, that legacy has to do with leaving material objects. And I looked it up. in the dictionary. And most of the definitions have to do with materiality of how much money we leave to one another, when we die, or physical possessions or a house or whatever, assets. But I believe that legacy stems from how we live. And I learned this as I was sitting with my sister when she was dying. And it was the middle of the night, and Dave and Lois and I were whispery talking. Lois couldn't sleep, so we were sitting with her, and Dave asked the question, how do you want us to memorialize you? What do you want your memorial to be like? And she had no idea. And I said, without thinking about it, that your memorial is about your legacy, celebrating your legacy. And she said, well, what is my legacy? So I proceeded to name all the things she had done with her life. I said, it doesn't matter. I said, well, you did this and you helped, youth get into nature and, inner city people and pottery and beauty and art. And she was just like lying there like, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Nothing moved her. So then I got quiet, and then I said, well, first of all, she had an experience during her very first of many brain surgeries of the universe, the fabric of the universe, as she put it, being made of love. And so for 14 years, she said, love is all that matters. It became her mantra. And so I said, well, Lo, you really taught all of us about love being the thing that matters most. And that was like, it just landed like that's what her legacy was that made a difference. That's what mattered to her, was the fact that she had taught us about love, that she was leaving a legacy of love. And so what I came to understand about that and about legacy is that legacy is about how we love and how we live. How we live,
Yeah. I'm thinking about how that pertains to loneliness. And I think if I can kind of tune into the phenomenology of loneliness, when there's an acute state of loneliness, there's this feeling of kind of pulling inward and feeling like really, really disconnected. And that's like the opposite of love. And I also think that when we're in that state, we don't know that who we are is a gift, and that our presence and our heart, it has something to offer to the community, and that actually it's absolutely necessary. This idea of being necessary to community is absent when we're in that utter state of loneliness. It is still true that we're necessary to community, but we are disconnected from our knowing of that. And our feeling of it. And all the concepts in the world won't help us to actually find it in our hearts that our presence is necessary, and that our love is a gift to the world. So that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying.
Is a gift to the world, however small or large one's world is, because everything ripples out. Everything ripples out. It's funny, Laura, I just finished reading this novel, which I didn't have any idea that it was going to be so applicable to our conversation today. And it's called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And it's about this woman who has had such a dramatic trauma in her life that she has no idea how to relate to the world and to relate. But this trauma, as she goes and unfolds through the story unfolds, she becomes available to a completely different way of living. And it's so beautiful a story of what all of us, what you just said, of learning that we matter, that our love matters, that our, I don't even know how to say it because
Yeah.
you just said it. And now I can't remember how you said it, but
Yeah. Well, I love that you also said that it doesn't have to be big, like it can be as simple as bringing food to someone who's sick, you know, and in our culture, we're all about, spectacle and making a splash and all that. And so we can forget how those small ways of expressing our love make a difference, and matter. So we are coming to the point where we are going to need to wind up, but I know that you wanted to tell our listeners about your work at the Hermitage. And so I think that our interview wouldn't be complete without us talking about that, because it's so related to the topic of solitude and loneliness. So what would you like to share with us about your work at the Hermitage?
well, I mean, you asked the question of me earlier about, how does, or maybe we were just talking about how does solitude differ from loneliness, and aloneness differ from loneliness. And I believe and I experience and I see that what happens with people as they engage in solitude in relationship with counsel and with the natural world, they begin to have a deeper intimacy with themselves. And that intimacy with self, and I believe that there's we could talk about self in a couple of ways. The small s self, which is how we operate in the world, but the larger capitalized word self is who we are at our essence. And as we connect more deeply to that essential quality of self with the capital S that comes from deep intimacy with ourselves through solitude and through a connection in the natural world, that becomes the strong foundation from which connection to other and connection to community can happen, and where we find our gifts hidden in our traumas and our wounds. And that's really what the process of Hermitage awakens.
Yes, and how important for that it is to have a break from technology. I mean, the Hermitage enforces just turning off the modern world for a minute so that we can even hear these voices that are all crowding around. They all want to speak to us all the time, but we're not available to listen.
Yeah.
And so we have, because our culture is so intrusive and insistent, I mean, everywhere we turn, there's some, think grabbing our attention about buy this, or, go on this, this vacation. So it's so important to just turn that off and have silence,
And in our culture that tells us who we should be and how we should be, and
Oh,
so that we
yeah.
can't even feel and find ourselves. And the Hermitage process enables us to find ourselves, find ourself.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what we find is that our self, that capital S self, is not isolated, that it's actually in communion and relationship constantly. It's 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 yeah. So I think what happens is we find that capital S self is different from what we thought it is.
Right. It's so
Yes.
true.
Yeah. Well, I believe that's a pretty good place for us to wind up for today. And I just wanted to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we end?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm really grateful for the conversation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. I just want to say my website, I have two websites, one for the Hermitage, which is about soulworks.com, www.about, SOULWORKS soulworks.com, and people can contact me there. I'd be happy to have conversations with people about this, to extrapolate from here. I'm offering a 30-minute free consultation for anybody who wants to continue the conversation. And then the Spirit of Resh Foundation also has a website, and that's RESH, reshfoundation.org. And you can learn about the Compassionate Community Project and other projects we're doing about legacy and supporting people and in this cultural realignment. So I welcome people's contact, questions, conversation. And again, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm excited to see the summit when it's complete.
Thank you, Lily. I really have enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for your generosity and everything that you've offered. It's so multidimensional, and there's so many kernels of richness that I think we can savor going forward. I know I will. So thank you again for your generosity, and we'll be seeing you soon, I hope, in some other way. And thank you.